Hello, I'm Deborah Shamoon at the National University of Singapore, and the title of my presentation today is Boxes and Balloons on First and Third Person Narration in Manga and Comics. The distinction between first and third person narration is central to understanding the formal features of any fiction text or medium. While it's easy to portray the interiority of the characters in prose, narrative in visual media such as film, television, and animation tends towards externality and third-person narration. Devices to indicate first-person narration in film, such as point-of-view shots and voiceover, are by convention used only sparingly. In comics or manga, the possibilities of creating either first or third-person narration are limitless. However, certain genres and styles tend to favor one or the other. This presentation will contrast two extreme examples: Silver Age Marvel superhero comics, which feature extensive use of text boxes in third-person narration, and Japanese shoujo manga or girls comics, which develop first-person narration in free-floating text outside word balloons. This contrast demonstrates the underlying structural assumptions of each genre and shows why certain genres gravitate towards one or the other narrative form. Freeing the inner monologue of the main character from the word or thought balloon and transforming it to free-floating text allowed for the creation of first-person narration. This kind of first-person narration can also be seen in some American and French independent comics in the autobiographical genre as a means of representing interiority. Looking at these various examples can suggest new direction for formal analysis of manga using narrative theory. Here, we see a playful example of comics form and expression by Art Spiegelman, the creator of Mouse. He's reflecting on the difference between text boxes and speech balloons. Speech balloons are the comic's equivalent of dialogue or direct quotation, while text boxes are somewhat similar to authoritative, detached, omniscient narration in literature or voiceover narration in film. But there is a third option Spiegelman doesn't present, and that is text outside word balloons or text boxes, a technique developed in shoujo manga to express the interiority of the main characters. The development of a clear, controlled narrative voice in either first or third person was key to the development of the modern novel, but these effects for representing the interiority of characters are harder to achieve in visual media, which tend toward externality. We see the characters in live-action film or animation as we do interlocutors in real life. While we may identify with them, it's more difficult to inhabit their thoughts as in a first-person novel. Devices to replicate first-person narration in film, such as point-of-view shots and voiceover narration, are unpopular. Audiences tend to find those techniques intrusive and unconvincing. Of course, in comics, we can also identify a visual narrator, or what Baitens calls a mega-narrator, but this presentation focuses on text narration. Comics and manga in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s also tend toward externality and third-person omniscient narration. This is especially true of US newspaper strips. And this is Prince Valiant by Hal Foster and Flash Gordon by Alex Raymond. Foster never used speech balloons, which he believed cluttered and obscured the art. Although the text is not contained in boxes, there's a clear third-person omniscient narrative voice, and all dialogue is in quote marks, as in a novel. Another feature of this style is that the text describes the image, so there's a dual layer of signification. Foster and Raymond were a huge influence on artists who created superhero comics for Marvel and DC in the 1950s and 60s, including Jack Kirby and Wally Wood, who were influenced by their dynamic action layouts. From this, we can see US comics' tendency to portray action as a tableau, in contrast to manga's in-the-moment style. We can also see this kind of third-person narration in manga, for instance, in The Legend of Kamui by Shirato Sanpei. As Ryan Holmberg discusses, Shirato made extensive use of third-person narration because he intended The Legend of Kamui to instruct children in Marxist ideology and to provide an alternative communist history of Japan. There are numerous lengthy comments explaining agricultural techniques, the status of minorities, and class struggle. But in this example here, the narrator comments on and describes the action. Even though the art style is very different from Prince Valiant, this is an example of the in-the-moment style rather than tableau, there's a similar dual signification of text and image and third-person narrator commenting on the action. But this is a kind of an unusual example. Manga in general has tended not to use expository text boxes. Shoujo manga, or romance comics for girls, first emerged in the 1930s, then later developed a sophisticated narrative and aesthetic idiom by the early 1970s to represent complex stories of teen psychological development. The genre derives from the style of illustration called jojoga, or lyrical pictures, that accompanied serialized novels in girls' magazines of the 1920s and 30s. We can see that influence in this example from Maki's Whistle by Maki Miyako in 1960. There's a lot of free-floating text in this series, but the narrative voice is variable. Sometimes it's Maki's thoughts, sometimes the remembered dialogue of another character, and sometimes, as here, a third-person narrator, as in a picture book, explaining what is going on in the frame below. And the art is expressive rather than representational, which is also typical of shoujo manga. First-person narration outside word balloons developed in shoujo manga in the 1960s. Manga scholar Yomota Inuhiko asserts that text outside word balloons is equivalent to first-person narration. The emphasis on the inner life of the main character is appropriate to the genre of shoujo manga, which is all about depicting emotion. And here's one example, Flower Petal Diary by Nishitani Yoshiko from 1968. This story has a clearly articulated first-person narrative voice, appropriate for a story presented as a teenage girl's diary. Here we see her thoughts illustrated expressively with images of the character she's thinking about. Here's another example from the ballet manga Swan. The art is decorative and expressive, even abstract, in the repeated images of the main character, with her thoughts scattered about the page in free-floating text. Here's another example from The Heart of Thomas by Hagio Moto. Rather than blocks of text, the words are integrated into the artwork, which is highly expressive, and visually representing the mental state of the character whose thoughts we're reading. This style is firmly entrenched in the shoujo manga genre, as in this example from Hot Road by Tsumugi Taku. First-person narration drifts across the page, alternating between vertical and horizontal text, layered over and around the art with generous use of empty space, representing the teenage girl protagonist's subjectivity. And first-person narration outside text boxes now appears across all genres in manga. Although this kind of first-person narration is a feature of manga, we do see quite a lot of first-person in American comics as well, even in Marvel superhero comics, at least recently. This is an example from Daredevil from 2011, written by Mark Waid. The opening 2 pages of this issue feature first-person narration scattered across the art, although it is contained in text boxes, and this style continues throughout this issue. And of course, Daredevil, like other Marvel titles, was not always written in this way. In the 1960s, when the series began, the narration was strictly third person. This switch happened in the 1980s when Frank Miller took over as writer and magnified the film noir aspect of the series. Voiceover narration in the first person is a feature of the film noir genre. But it's worth reflecting a bit more on the state of narration in Silver Age Marvel comics of the 1960s. As we see in this example, the text box is in the third person and describes and explains the action depicted in the art. Not only that, but the characters themselves tend to explain the action in thought and speech balloons. In the bottom panel here, there are multiple levels of signification working overtime to deliver the same information as the art: the text box, the word balloons, and the sound effects. It seems almost ridiculously overdetermined. One reason for this is the Marvel method of writing. As Hatfield describes, quote, "The artist independently created breakdowns, meaning page layouts and drawings, roughs at least, but often thoroughly detailed drawings, after which the nominal writer would supply dialogue and captions. The writer was more accurately an ex post facto scripter or reviser, the dialoguer responsible for placing text on already determined layouts." As Stan Lee was seeing the completed story for the first time as he was filling in the text, it's not surprising that he comments on the action like a bystander. This dual layer of signification between the text and art also points to the gap between the writer and the artist, as though Stan Lee doesn't trust the artist to effectively tell the story. And it's also worth noting that the amount of writing Lee actually did seems to have varied significantly. Wally Wood claims that Lee expected him to do all of the writing. And indeed, in the issues of Daredevil with Wood credited as artist, there are many fewer text boxes or commentary on the action. But it's not just the dual signification. Narration in Silver Age Marvel Comics is marked by a chatty tone, direct address to the reader, and shameless hucksterism. For example, Lee, or whoever is writing here, interpolates the Marvel fan and congratulates him for reading. In this example, he apologizes for wasting time on character development and promises to get back to the action. In this example, the text box draws our example to formal aspects of the lettering. From a narratological perspective, this is a really bizarre approach to storytelling. Neither novels nor film generally function in this way. But this chatty insider tone credited to Stan Lee cemented the emotional relationship between Marvel and its readers. Nevertheless, there's a very strong sense of externality in these comics. As in this example, Matt's inner monologue is confined to thought balloons, even as the artwork tends more towards technical drawing or schematic, with the cutaway view of his secret workout room. In the bottom panel, there's an awkward attempt to visually represent his thoughts, realized as a series of faces arranged against a window, with a text box explaining that these are his thoughts. Needless to say, this sort of introspective visual representation doesn't appear very often in this era. Now, as I said, today, it's not so uncommon to see first-person narration even in Marvel Comics, but it's almost always contained in text boxes. To see an example of first-person narration integrated into the artwork, we have to look at more independent, individualistic creators. This example is from the sci-fi series Saga by Brian Vaughan and Fiona Staples. The narration belongs to Hazel, although she is only one of many focal characters, and she's clearly narrating in retrospect from a distance of many years, and commenting on things she didn't experience herself, such as how her parents met. Even though this is first-person narration outside word balloons, there's something very different about this from first-person narration in shoujo manga. Literary theory and narratology can help us to understand these differences. Not all first-person narration is the same. The style developed in classic shoujo manga of the 1970s is very similar to the psychological novel, for instance, Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky or The Golden Bowl by Henry James, which feature montage-like effects, changes of perspective, extensive use of interior monologue, and particularly stream-of-consciousness narration. There's no omniscient narrator conferring godlike authority over the plot. Everything is colored by the subjectivity of the focal characters. This is stream-of-consciousness narration, the thoughts of the character in the moment he experiences them. This kind of narration is what Gerard Genette calls intradiegetic, or within the plot, while Hazel's narration in Saga is extradiegetic, taking place outside the time of the plot. Hazel also frequently engages in prolepsis, or forecasting future events, as in this example, and the narrative moves unambiguously forward, typical of an action-based genre. The Heart of Thomas, on the other hand, is all about analepsis, or flashbacks, as the main character Yuri attempts to understand and reconcile the past trauma of sexual abuse. To be more specific then, free-floating text in shoujo manga is not just first-person, but stream of consciousness, which is appropriate to the psychological stories that they narrate. Now, our discussion of first-person narration in Western comics wouldn't be complete without also considering autobiographical comics, a genre that's come to dominate the indie comics scene in the US. As this is a highly experimental and heterogeneous genre, I'm not going to attempt to account for everything or make sweeping generalizations, but just take a brief look at some prominent influential examples. Here, the granddaddy of autobiographical comics, American Splendor, Harvey Pekar appears like the subject of a documentary film or an interview subject, not a first-person narrator. This external style reflects the way the comic was created, with Pekar writing a script and very basic layouts and sending them to Robert Crumb and other artists to illustrate. There's also an intentional defamiliarization at work here, as Pekar engages in existential speculation. Another example is American Elf, a daily diary in a 4-panel strip by James Kochalka, where he presents himself externally with his thoughts in word balloons. And we see a similar use of externality with David B. in Epileptic. Even though the art is highly expressionistic, the text is carefully segregated from the art. And the same is true of Persepolis by Marjan Satrapi, and she worked with David B., which is why their art is similar. However, there are examples of narration outside text boxes in American comics. This is My Favorite Thing is Monsters by Emil Ferris. This comic is in the form of the diary of a teenage girl, to the extent of being drawn on actual spiral-bound notebooks. Like shoujo manga, it's narrated intradiegetically in a stream of consciousness style, and the artwork is expressionistic rather than mimetic. This example is from Blankets, which I think is closest to shoujo manga. It's the coming-of-age story of a sensitive, introspective teenage boy, and as we see here, the intradiegetic narration is fully integrated into the art as an aesthetic element, rather than separated from it. So, returning to Spiegelman, while there is an immediacy in speech balloons, there is even more immediacy in text integrated into the art. And I look forward to discussing this with you in person. Thank you.